Welcome back to Lessons from Lockdown this morning, everyone. We've now got Stephen Culber from Brunswick Secondary College joining us. Stephen, I'm looking forward to hearing your presentation.
Beautiful. Thank you very much. Good morning, lovely people. Hope we're all doing well. Checking my phone to make sure my time's on. If you could, as I present, I'll be doing my very best to kind of check the chat. I've got it open in front of my presentation, all going well. So if you've got any thoughts, jump in at any point. My name's Stephen Culber. You can find me on the internet at these various places, and I'm very excited about instructional video, flip learning, EduReading, which is an academic reading group, and Teachers Across Borders Australia. So my topic for today is maybe we should let a good crisis go to waste? Question mark. As an English teacher, I've instantly offended myself. So I'm sure you've heard this all over the place. Never let a good crisis go to waste, said Winston Churchill. I would say that if this is something that you genuinely believe, you might be slightly psychotic, and I'll try and expand on why that is as I present, I guess. But the main point that I'm trying to make essentially is that I don't think necessarily now is the best time to be changing things or reshuffling anything. It might be a good time to reconsider things. But the greatest changes that have occurred, I think, have occurred in the minds and hearts of teachers. I don't know about hearts, but you got to be show offy when you can. So obviously we've all been doing this, soaring the tree while it's growing, flying the plane while it's flying, repairing the plane while it's flying, all that kind of stuff. That's pretty obvious. Just to get out of the way, yes, I am quite privileged, and I recognize that in every way possible. So just put that to one side as much as you can, that I'm aware. And so we're all aware that that's not something that has been, that is something that's been put to one side more or less. Second thing I'm not going to talk about is pedagogy and kind of online learning. I've got a couple of slides here that are sort of my go-tos for my usual topics of instructional video. There's a whole bunch of courses that I've done and been involved in, and kind of if you are doing any training in online learning through video, you've probably seen my face attached to some part of it somewhere along the way. And so the reason I'm telling you this is just to say essentially that for me, my pedagogy didn't change dramatically. These tools and these approaches I've always taken proved very useful, as it says here, a useful and suddenly relevant skill set. So it was all of a sudden came, the 4 years, and I just checked yesterday, there's 615 videos I've made over the last 4 years for my students have been relatively of great utility, let's say, of the time just gone. This is our little room set up, which I won't necessarily show you just because who cares, off topic. So what I'm going to take us through is my third lesson is basically the one thing that I've done, which I have not done as much of during lockdown as compared to normal unlockdown, is that a phrase I can use? Times, is just writing. And so rather than kind of think of, try and make any pithy oversimplifications of the lessons that I learned, I figured I'd take you through things that I have written and had published during the timeline of lockdown, because I'm basically practicing autoethnography, which is basically researching yourself. And so though that might sound very self-serving, I'm hoping that just the process of going through these stages will kind of give you, whether you're in Victoria or not, a bit of an insight of kind of what it was like. And if you're if you're actually in Victoria, it might help you to jog your own memory, because people talk about this quite freely, how the idea of time has become pretty lucid and pretty hard to kind of glean from. And so I guess, that's kind of my modus operandi. So I'll be telling you not so much any final lessons, but lessons that I felt I had learned at different points along the sort of timeline, as it were, and I've sort of broken it up for you. So Liz says, what matters more, teaching or tech? It's an easy question. Teaching, of course. I was just watching a webinar from Jared Cooney Hovarth, who's everyone's favorite brain person, let's say. I'm sure this is a better word that escapes me. But and he gave a pretty good overview of the research into technology and teaching with computers and those sort of things. And it's not really that exceptional if you kind of want to frame it quite simply like that. What we know from the research is that technology doesn't really improve learning. It's kind of like, yeah, it might help, might not. Flipped learning actually as a pedagogy is the same. It's kind of either neutral or slightly positive, but not negative. So, hey, that's a good intervention. So, yeah, in terms of teaching always matters the most. And so when I bang on about instructional video, a lot of the things that I'm saying are things that affected me personally. So teaching into a camera, doing what I'm doing now has sort of helped me to become a better teacher, not in the real world or online or both or neither, but just actually watching myself back, editing video of me talking has made my clarifying questions and my instructions a lot clearer and a lot better. So feel free to jump in if you disagree on that one, that tech is more important. Most of the things I do are pretty low tech, and the focus is on the pedagogy always. So I'm hoping that as I go through these things, you'll kind of have some reflections of your own. You know, you can tell me what you were doing at the same time, or anything like that would be super useful, just to get an idea of kind of what we all went through, or what some of us went through perhaps. So I'm calling this pre-lockdown, and this is a section from a book chapter I wrote, Scary Times as Concerns Mount Among Teachers. The lack of safety at school becomes increasingly apparent. So this is the big scary time, I guess, pre-lockdown. I'll do a chunk and then I'll come back. So yeah, this is when I wrote my most fiery stuff, I guess. I don't know if anyone remembers, but the GP happened, I think, on a Saturday or a Sunday in Melbourne. And this is a photo from there, so you can tell it's pre-lockdown for definites. And this is kind of just when people were starting to think like, oh, maybe there's a bit, well, we're not so sure about this. Maybe this COVID thing is real. I think from memory, I ran a teach meet in Kew on the Friday, and everyone was still there. I think 2 people said they wouldn't come. And so it's really hard to picture now, but we really didn't know what was going on. And we were sort of starting to get a bit suspicious and read a lot of articles and get a bit scared. So this is from March 20th. This is, as I said, my most fiery thing that I wrote. So at this time, I guess the lesson was no one cares about teachers. And I guess it's safe to say we were shit scared, to be completely honest, if I speak for myself and my colleagues. So, you know, panic scrolling was sort of what we were doing at the time. And the lesson that I had was that us teachers are a pretty obedient bunch. We all kept turning up, even though we spent every time when we weren't in class being pretty nervous, pretty scared, watching press conferences, sharing articles, updating kind of school status and seeing if anything was happening and we might be able to get free. And at this time, the thing I was talking about was the hopes that teacher status would improve and that inequity would be addressed, which is quite naive, I believe, at that time. March 23rd, I said the actual content will be of the same quality. The thing that will be lacking is all the important stuff. So relationships and actually being able to monitor our students and all those sort of things. So to me, that is and always was through all of these steps, something that was at the forefront of my mind, the inequity in our system and how it might be solved. So, question we've heard a lot at this conference about tech being a great leveler, but also a divider. What should we focus on and what should we leave out if online is the future? I would say online isn't the future, because if it was, it would have already happened. It will become a bigger part of our lives, I would guess. But you have to also keep in mind, that while it might seem, I think of technology at the moment, it's like the phrase I've used before is dancing with the devil at midnight. So as teachers, we might want more flexibility. So we might say, okay, I'll teach some of my lessons online. And that's highly risky, because as soon as you do that, you risk replacing yourself. So why would they come to me online when they could come to, let's say, I don't know, we'll go to New South Wales. Eddie Wu is a better maths teacher than me, guaranteed, because I don't teach maths. Why don't we just send them online to Eddie rather than to myself? And you might think, well, that's great. Everyone's getting the best instruction. But then there's also industrial issues that would occur from that, because then there'd be less jobs in Melbourne and so on. So I would say online is not the future. Teachers with a digital mindset probably is the future, or I bloody well hope so anyway. But yeah, so it is a great leveler. I don't agree with that statement at all. Australia is amongst the most inequitable education system in the OECD, not in the world, because that would be an exaggeration. But inequity is the main problem that we have. Jumping holus bolus to digital wouldn't help that. In fact, it would make it worse until we get that societal problem solved first. So again, jump in and correct me or disagree as you choose. What about in remote learning situation without tech? Would there be teaching? I think there would be, yeah. This had happened in our pre-technology world. I think teachers would have just worked around it. A lot of radio, a lot of TV. Well, that's technology too, I guess, right? But there'd be a lot of snail mail stuff. If you think of kind of school of the air, school of the, radio, all that sort of stuff, would have happened without tech. Would there be teaching? Yeah, I think we'd still work it out. Would be my. It's a good question though. Without tech, would there be teaching? I wonder. All right. Unless anything else pops up, I'm going to jump ahead to remote learning 1.0. So this is kind of when we went to our first phase. I've got here enjoying the novelty of remote learning new methods and tools with students. So I'm hoping that the things that I wrote at this time will be a little bit more positive, because at this time, because we were so scared and worried during this period, by the time we came to remote learning, we was firstly so relieved that it just felt so much better to be home and safe as we saw it. And so the remote learning, we were a lot more sort of open to it, I guess. There we go. We're right. So this is a piece I wrote about how our teach meets went online, and I was pretty excited about it then, as I remain now. So just like as a mini illustration of that, when I mentioned the teach meet that we held in just before lockdown, we had about 25 people there. The first teach meet we ran online, not me personally, but Matt Esterman from New South Wales. I think we had 87 people. And since then, probably the most popular has been 700, I think. So, and this, I'm hoping most of us, if we're teachers, will be aware of this. Because recently I'm writing some stuff about this sort of thing, as you might imagine. And I watched it back, and without the risk of, having to go back to school being something that's preying or playing on my mind, I watched the video and it was quite, was fine. He sounded quite reasonable. He urged us to go back to school, but apart from that, it was very thankful and very glowing and bright. But at the time, I remember watching this multiple times and being deeply angry and disappointed. The obvious thing is, of course, he had no say or sway to send us back to school, but he referred to remote teaching as child minding. So I think if you're a teacher, you might have to take that to the ballot box, so to speak, as I know I will be. Moving some things around so I can actually read. This was May 4th, so don't rush back to the old normal. So there you go, very naively positive. I'm saying naive for me, I think. If you believe this, then good for you. I was with you back on this date. So basically talking about the cushioning effect of school, and that learning loss wasn't a valid concern. Basically, the theory being, according to me, is that over the summer, our students regress, they lose content, they lose knowledge, and then we kind of catch them back up over the summer holidays every year, and that this would be no different. Obviously, looking back on that now, might be a slightly different kettle of fish once you think of just how long that they've lost. Actually, Lauren Sayer, who I hope you know, because she's an excellent educational thinker along with us, she said that as Victorian teachers, we might have been perhaps the longest teaching via remote methods teachers in the world. So if you're a Victorian teacher or engaged with Victorian education, just sort of hold that as a truism that we may kind of, we got a skill set that may not be that common. So May 12th, again, this was all about going back to school. And for me, I think at the time I was saying that it was reasonable that we should go back. but because essentially the students that were most in need weren't there, weren't clocking on, and that nowadays is increasingly true. So what I've got here is the build back better theory, which is John Hattie also echoed my stolen quote, which is from Rebecca Winthrop from the Brookings Institute and out that way. So that was probably the only time in my life where John Hattie and myself used the same phrase without irony attached to it from either side, I guess. So at this point, I was like, yep, let's go back to school. But keep in mind, social distancing is impossible. Maybe flexible work. So that's my dance with the devil concept. And that we should have less emphasis on standardized tests and less class time. And that some portion of delivery should be online. So based on what I just said, I guess I've sort of given the game away that I no longer think that's necessarily the best way forward, but it's something to consider, I guess. May 24th, okay, I was all about, I said we should cancel NAPLAN, and then it did, so obviously they read the article. Just kidding. I said ATAR will be so altered that it might be worth reconsidering something else and all that sort of stuff. And then, teachers newly digitally able to sort of, I think I referred to it as power tools as opposed to the normal tools that we've used. All right. So then July 6th, I had this published. The top right-hand corner is my bio in French, which was exciting to me. So they is Education International, which is the union of the world, basically. So the United Nations of Unions. And so they published this piece for me and translated into French and Spanish, because just like the UN, they have multiple languages. And what I was banging on about here was basically, because we all jumped on Zoom essentially, and so I spent way much more time than I care to admit researching kind of encryption and end-to-end encryption and different tools, different technology, and kind of gave a big, long, complicated review of what tools were best for teachers and why, and that included kind of contacting all these sort of people that deal with techno-ethics, which I didn't know was a thing until I started researching this, and antitrust people, so people that basically review privacy policies. I read a fair few privacy policies of all of the different video conferencing tools and all that sort of stuff. And so that, I guess, the rest is all quite positive, and we're all going to be good. Let's think about different ways that we can do this better. And this gives a bit of a slightly more skeptical view at this point. All right, so I'm going to check for my questions. James says, why haven't teachers in Melbourne pushed back against returning to school? We have seen protests in the USA over safety concerns. Why do you think this hasn't happened here? Okay, so my primary belief is that teachers are an obedient bunch. I think there was a fair bit of pushback at the beginning. I think the main thing that I've noticed is just that when teachers have time, they have time to be radical. And when they don't have time, they're not radical, is basically my baseline assumption. So, for example, when we were in remote teach, so when we're teaching face-to-face and they sent us home, obviously no one protested or did anything there, because why would you? I guess you're heading safe. But once we were in remote learning, and then we were just the question of going back to school was discussed, there was real energy there. And I think a part of that reason is just because by not being face-to-face, teachers had more time available and they're actually able to have time to write, get together, organize. I personally was involved in probably 3 or 4 separate groups from different people trying to do what you're talking about. But I guess the protest, so basically a protest has just happened yesterday or 2 days ago here in Melbourne. And so the actual protesting is illegal due to the restrictions on all of the other things that are taking place here. So you have to wear a mask, you can only exercise for an hour, soon to be 2 hours, and you can only be 5 kilometers outside of your home and similar things like that. So there have been protests, but it's generally believed to be kind of the lunatic fringe, just because you're protesting against something that you're kind of not causing, but you're exposing yourself to the thing that you're protesting against. I don't know. I don't know if that answers your question or not, but that's time is the main thing. And then the second thing is just the restrictions that are in place are quite effective, I guess, and therefore they minimize that sort of thing. Alrighty, so I call this remote learning 2.0 just because we continue to do remote learning for the majority. I'm a high school teacher, so that's my bias. Prep to 10 students kept doing remote learning, but for a senior teacher like myself, year 11s and 12s, they returned, but they all had to wear masks and we as teachers didn't, which if you put all the COVID things to one side, the fact that a teacher needs to be heard, needs to have their emotions read and their face visible in class, but the students don't. I think that to me says a great deal about our view of education. If they're not empty vessels or sponges for information, they're definitely not the leading light according to that. So basically, yeah, we're all in limited spaces and teachers were ships in the night. You never saw anyone, you never saw your leadership, and you never saw your colleagues because you were all separately, safely divided into your own little spaces, which is probably why there wasn't much pushback at that point. If you're thinking of the US protests, we just didn't see each other enough to actually organise any effective complaints. So at this time, I guess writing was a lot easier because you're at school and you can't, less of the sort of habit to just kind of go to the normal places you go in your home to relax, unwind or whatever. As we were at school, I wrote a fair bit more just about more general topics, things that I'm interested in. This was a more semi-academic thing about Teach Meets, how they went online. But it was a short-lived phase anyway, as you can see. And then with the stage we're in now is remote learning 3.0. Back to working from home, much less novelty, much more concerning. More students have disconnected and enthusiasm and energy wanes from both sides, from the teachers and from the students. So to me, yeah, that's where we're at now. I don't know if anyone wants to disagree with me on the enthusiasm and energy waning, but I guess the difference is if it were this time of term in a normal year, we'd probably all be over school as well. But because we're remote, it feels a bit different. It feels a bit odd to have that kind of lack of energy kicking in. And so this just came out yesterday. So this is the only thing I've written, the only thing I've wrote in this phase. Well, actually, that's not entirely true. I'm mostly writing things with a much longer publication date. And so I'm essentially saying in this thing that the NAPLAN review is a poorly thought out solution and that in the current time, it might be worth considering a better alternative. Essentially that we should have a sample test instead of a whole cohort census test, which is where you do a census, you test everyone at the same time. You think of the PISA test that most people know of, but not know very well. That's a sample test and it's been going for 20 years. Happens every 3 years. No one questions the validity of the test beyond some relatively minor kind of, as soon as you start to compare countries, it becomes a little bit more complicated. But as a baseline, people trust that test. NAPLAN's been running for 12 years, hasn't shown any improvement in scores or any downward trend in scores either. And so to me, that's a pretty good sign that it's probably just a waste of time if PISA is doing the same thing and has been doing it for much longer anyway. But that's kind of, up in the air. And I've probably got, let's see, about 5 or 10 minutes. So I might jump onto the next one, which is sort of the big acronyms that in education are all the rage. And I'd love, jump in with any thoughts or questions as I go through them, but I'll give you my 2 cents. So the NAPLAN review just came out. I was part of the practitioners reference group, which basically means, Victoria, Queensland, New South Wales, ACT. So there were 3 teachers from each of those states, teachers or principals, independent, independent government and sometimes even a union rep in there as well. And we were speaking about basically the NAPLAN problems and the fact that it wasn't working as we hoped it would and that it wasn't especially useful for us teachers, that we should move to moderation, we should get teachers involved, all these sort of things. But as if you want to read this article I wrote, you can get a bit more insight into the review. The review is 180 pages long, so enjoy that if you like. The discussion of ATAR, so the tertiary admission rank, the end of year whole of Australia, everyone gets a score, versus the learning passport. So to me, NAPLAN needs a rethink or a restart or a reboot, more above and beyond what's called for in the review. Whereas ATAR, I think that from this could be entirely wrong, but the people that I've heard speaking about ATAR are basically just saying get rid of it without a clear alternative. People have talked about a learning passport, doing the sort of US model where you record all the extracurricular activities that the students have done and all those sort of things. To me, I think this needs more consideration, and it's not as simple as just burn it down and start from scratch. And so I guess that's what I would say about NAPLAN as well. I think because of the whole COVID thing, everyone sort of thinks, well, that's it. Let's burn down the government. Let's burn down all of our institutions. And at the start of the whole Corona situation, I probably would have agreed with that and said, yeah, this is it. This is going to change the world. The fact that we're all teaching remotely will be an uncomebackable sort of change of the entire world, a paradigm shift. I don't think anyone should be genuinely believing that with a straight face. I've been saying similar things to that effect, but if we're a little bit more realistic and pessimistic, I don't think that's necessarily what's going to happen. PISA, so I got to speak to Sue Thompson, who's the head of ASA. So she basically writes the Australia snapshot for PISA. There's a couple of issues with PISA more generally, but I'm interested to see what people think about PISA. And, as we're having a go at all the acronyms, thoughts on NAPLAN, ATAR, and PISA as kind of big picture overall ideas and what we should be doing about them or not. I'm taking probably perhaps a more realistic view. And, this is a much less popular topic, but the role of big edtech, and we call it that because it is bigger, richer and more powerful than every government in the world. And so, it takes a much bigger question. But if you just think of the simple fact that the thing that's most valuable in our world is data. So people would your data is of much greater value than all of the money in your bank account. And increasingly, data becomes a honeypot. The more data you have, the more it's worth. For example, if I stole your credit card details, to me, that would be worth a very small amount of value. But if I was Google, let's say, and I could get that piece of data and fit it into a much broader patchwork or puzzle of you as a person and the rest of your data, that would be worth a great deal, of course. And similarly, probably the credit card's a bad example. But, if I could find out your favorite chip flavor means nothing to me. If I slot that into a much broader profile on, say, Google or Microsoft, Amazon, any one of those big tech companies, Pearson, heaven forbid, then you can see how that value would be exponential and iteratively valuable. And so, which is why we get to Education International. I would say this is the best hope that we've got to sort of solve big world problems like that. And I'm going to sort of wrap it up here. I'm going to fast forward through a whole bunch of slides that were alternate discussion topics. Take us to the end. I believe what might be needed, less face-to-face time. We lead the OECD, we're above the OECD average in time spent in class. I think our students have proven that they deserve more autonomy and can act on it. We need some flexibility into timetabling. We need, with the freed up time, to be coaching teachers to be better experts, better professionals, and all the rest of it. We need professional learning that is collaborative, which is very rare. We need genuine parent involvement. We need to open up schools as hubs of learning, much more of an open door policy post-COVID, or if that's a thing. We need more practitioners, teachers, to engage with research. I think if we had enough time, that might be a lot more achievable. We need to promote teacher excellence as an entire profession, but also in the specific. We need clear guidelines and roles around middle leadership. That's not something I've spoken about up until now, but it's something that I could go into detail if pressed. We need to challenge and resist teacher bashing, which is something I'm working on at the moment. We need to develop teacher voice firstly, and then student voice and agency secondly, in that order. And we need to have no whole cohort testing, but sample testing as an alternative to give us the data that we as teachers most need. So that's kind of my running tour through lockdown, what it was like, some of the lessons that I think I learned, and what I think as a result might be needed. But as I said at the beginning, I think it's quite reasonable for us to let this crisis go to waste in many respects, because the teachers themselves and the parents and the students have changed irreversibly. And so a hasty push to, burn everything down and start from scratch isn't necessarily needed. So that's me. I'll go back to the start in case you want to, sling me with disagreement, barbs, personal attacks. I'll put my details up on the screen.
Thank you so much, Stephen. I really appreciate your sort of the time you've taken to put together some really quite solid provocations there and thoughts around, I suppose, your experiences of what's happened and what the future might look like. I held off on a couple of questions at the end there, so sorry about that, so that we had a bit to talk about at the end. So have you got a bit of time to respond to people's questions?
Yeah, please.
Excellent. So I will start with a question from Ilya, who I think you know and I know quite well. And she's asking the question, what do you think we will see in classrooms in 2021, 2022 that are different from 2020? Given that, we've had COVID this year, and whilst we seem to be coming out of, the second wave, we don't really know what the future is sort of going to put before us. Like, do you think that we're going to see massive changes in check in terms of attitude, or do you think that what we're really going to see is potentially what you say you're hoping for, if I've heard you correctly, which is some more subtle, less tangible changes?
Yeah, I think, if we're relying on the structures to change, I think what we've seen over the last however long we've been in this situation is that structures, they bend, but they don't break. So exams are still going on. NAPLAN's been put on pause, but it'll come back perhaps with a vengeance next year. I don't think there's any great moves to pay teachers more, despite the vague sense that we might be okay after all. So in 2021, I really don't see anything dramatically changing at a structural level. I think the things we need to focus on are basically reflecting on what we've learned personally, which is why I commend Tim for this sort of a conference, bringing together people to kind of, as sort of like a message in a bottle. This is what we thought at this time. And my presentation itself was just sort of me looking back at what I thought, or what I had said, what I had on record said, let's say, and sort of thinking, I'm not really convinced that that's true. I don't know. I think it's easy to, talk rhetoric, and I could probably list 10 or 20 leading educational thinkers who have all said teaching has changed irreparably. But I think unless you're at a very well-off school that has, the type of budget to allow the flexibility that I would like to see across the whole system, I just don't think that that's happening. If you see me write an article saying the world's changed and it'll never go back, you can probably trust that I'm sitting there winking to myself, sort of going, it's worth, if we say that that's the case, then maybe it will happen. But realistically, the changes, I think, have occurred within the human beings rather than within the system. So I'm not going to predict too much on 2021 and what it might look like, but I think especially term 4 will be really telling around, the concept of essential learnings, and getting a lot of the rhetoric has changed significantly about, reconnecting with kids, not catching up kids, importantly, but sort of reconnecting, giving them the essential learning and getting them to kind of form social bonds again and get back into the routine. So there's positive signs, but how that 2021, I would imagine everything clicks back into gear as normal, barring any kind of corona-related needs.
I was going to say, I know when James Merlino announced, I think, when was it, sort of in June, they said, right, we're through this now, we're going to bring all the teachers and we're going to have a 3-day sort of workshop, and we're going to figure out what worked, and we're going to get it started for term 3. I was a little bit skeptical and a bit cynical. I think that the reflections from this whole process are just going to take such a long time to understand actually what really worked. So the next comment that I have, I don't have a name for this, is that, so you've sort of said teaching over tech, but what can we do to make sure teachers aren't made redundant, I suppose, or aren't sort of the hubris or debris in light of increasing technologies that sort of, I suppose, purport to make life easier and teaching easier?
Yeah, sure. I mean, this to me lends to the sort of conversation we're having before we jumped on live. It's sort of, I think of a global view of education, which is something I sometimes pretend I'm capable of doing. Those countries without a strong union presence are the countries that are most at risk, most under threat from technology. And you might think, oh, it's just computers, what's the big deal? I could give you numerous examples. There's a school in the United States that had 7 teachers total, so that's one of each, if you can picture that. And they had 1,000 students, and all of the students turned up in their chinos and their sort of corporate shirts, and they clocked into their computers. And the 7 teachers, one PE, one whatever, one maths, one English, one science, were kind of their tutors. So they'd sort of walk the rows of kids and they'd just sort of check in. Initially, it was a charter school, of course, so it had amazing test results, as you might imagine. All of a sudden, everyone went, this is amazing. Within 3 years, it had closed down, and students had left in droves as a result of that. Something called the African School of Excellence. Half of the day is devoted to students teaching one another. You might think, what's that got to do with tech? In any school, the most expensive element is a well-trained teacher. That costs a lot of money. They do a lot of training, and they cost money, believe it or not. So if you can cut down the amount of teachers that you need, whether you do it through tech most predominantly, or whether you get the students to teach one another, as in that example, I think that gives you a really good idea of the kind of things that are happening in countries without a union presence. Whereas in Australia, that's less of an issue. In the United States, it is more of an issue. So we have Summit Learning and kind of places like that, where Facebook is basically experimenting on a whole generation of students. And then it's been $1 billion failure. There's been many a $1 billion failure in the States around that kind of approach, where teachers can be replaced to a certain extent. So I guess that's why I speak more broadly about teacher replacement is a real thing. It does happen. It can happen. And technology is usually, one of the 4 horsemen that brings that about, let's say. One of the conditions that it requires is a weak union movement, and a weak and that's across all industries. No one's standing up and saying, we won't allow that, or we should stop that because it makes teachers redundant, or it's bad for our students, or whatever the logic behind it is. However you frame that discussion, I think unionism is probably the only way forward, if I'm being completely honest. Mm-hmm. If anyone's got a different one, I'd love to hear it, but it's just a power thing. They have more power, more money, more influence than any Department of Education in Victoria, Australia, anywhere in the world, really.
No, look, I can certainly understand what you're saying there. Now, I've got a question from James, and this is in reference to your comment around, I suppose, esteeming teacher excellence. So given that we have AITSL, we have the AITSL professional teaching standards, and within the context of Australia, some states have adopted those in terms of having HALTs, I think it is, highly accomplished leading teachers, but whereas Victoria hasn't. How do we go actually about, I suppose, esteeming that excellence within the profession?
Yeah, I would probably reframe the question. This is sort of one of my recent interests. The HAT and HALT program is, from memory, 184 in 2019. We know there's 270,000 teachers, so that is 0.0004% of our teaching profession. So to me, that says that program isn't capturing teacher excellence, because if it was, then there'd be a lot more, I would hope, than 184. Mm-hmm. So to me, in its current state, at least, that's not the solution. I think the problem, and this goes back to a research concept that basically checking for teaching excellence or good teaching. So those are 2 separate things. Teacher quality or teaching quality. Testing for either of those is like the holy grail of research. My understanding is that it can be done. You need 30 individual observations by 5 different people. You need a consistent measure. So it can be done, but it's far, far, far too costly.
Mm-hmm.
And so what we get instead is things like the HALT program that are mostly, say, if I were to apply for it, it'd mostly be me doing a mini PhD or a mini master's or something like that, doing a lot of writing, reflection, and kind of paperwork. If we use me as an example, I'm sure I could pass that process. Whether that would make me a better teacher as a result, I would imagine it would make me a worse teacher because I'd be spending most of my time on weekends typing and from what I've heard, a lot of recording evidence and collecting evidence rather than acting on evidence, I guess. And so to me, that's kind of one of the open questions, open wounds in research, educational research. How do we support excellence? And obviously, I've proven my colours up until now. I'm a bit of a unionist, and so there's definitely a split between my union hat and my teacher hat because I would love to be rewarded to be excellent if and when I achieve that, but also that opens up risks because then it's performance pay, which we know has issues, and so I guess the easiest solution is to pay all teachers more. How we get that to happen, I'm not sure. But in the interim, I guess the issue with any teacher excellence program is that you're promoting things almost by necessity that don't come from the classroom. So the current model is, if you're a leading teacher, that means that you were so good at leadership that you're now a leader rather than you're so good at teaching that we said, yep, stay there and do more of that, please, and we'll pay you extra. So,
do you think the learning specialist roles and the creation of those is a way to esteem that sort of side of the profession?
Yeah, for sure. I think if it were applied more rigorously, it would be. I can think of hundreds of examples from schools that I'm aware of where that's basically just a reframed leadership position. Like you used to be a leading teacher, but now we call you a learning specialist because the union said we had to tick off this many learning specialists. So it's kind of a good concept in theory, but I think in implementation, it hasn't necessarily borne fruit. But I think that's the right direction to go, recognizing teaching excellence within a school. But then the same question is there, I guess, because learning specialists would be hired by a principal. We'd all love to think that principals are up to date with good teaching, but due to the amount of time that they have to give up for their leadership roles, that's not always true. So yeah, I'm answering questions with questions here, but
I don't think there are really any sort of solid answers at this stage. But look, I am mindful of the time, and I know that we are going to need to start getting ready for the next session. So I just want to take this opportunity to thank you so much for joining us. And, like I said, putting some really solid publications out there because, like I said, there's no answers yet.
Yeah, I'd like to thank you for putting this all together. It's been really exciting to watch.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Stephen. And we will be joined by Amanda Bickerstaff and Claire Westthorpe from Pivot Professional Learning at 12 o'clock. We look forward to seeing you everyone back then.